Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Let's play Burlington's Guess That Price. Back to school means back to saving. We're bringing you kids' jeans starting at, hold on a minute, just $11.99. Burlington's acing this test. What about character backpacks? We've got them starting at $12.99. Burlington's done it again. How about sneakers for the kids? A-plus brands and right on trend starting at $11.99. Saving is now in session. Burlington, deals, brands, wow! Styles and selections vary by location.
Let's play a game. I'm going to ask you to name one of President Trump's most flashy attack dogs. I'm guessing you're thinking about Laura Loomer, maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene. But what if I told you there was someone else, just as important? And he is the leader of a little-known agency, one that was just created back in 2008, the Federal Housing Finance Agency.
It's a relatively small agency. It's not even part of the cabinet, but it has a lot of power in that it oversees the U.S. mortgage market.
Rachel Siegel covers the economics of housing for The Washington Post. So she's one of the few people who is familiar with the FHFA, as it's called. How common is it for anyone other than you to know the name of the person heading up the Federal Housing Finance Agency?
Probably not very common, or at least not that they could fill in what FHFA stands for.
So who is the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency?
His name is Bill Pulte.
Bill Pulte. Remember that name, because he's got 3 million followers on Twitter, and he is leading this obscure agency in directions it's never gone before.
He has quite a platform, both just with his literal title and with his influence on social media. And he's really used that platform in two ways. One is to attack really hard on people that he doesn't like, on people that he's accusing of mortgage fraud. And then he'll also use that platform to kind of unexpectedly and suddenly announce policy. For a while, he was like taking cell phone photos of memorandums and just tweeting out the picture, or he'll tweet a policy and it isn't necessarily backed up with any official press release or other guidance.
You might be thinking, okay, but how much can this one guy do? It turns out the answer to that is a lot. In his first 6 months in office, he has led investigations into Democratic Senator Adam Schiff, New York's Attorney General, Leititia James, and even a member of the Federal Reserve's board. He accuses all three of mortgage fraud, and he has sent his findings to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution.
Pulte has really fashioned himself in a way that Trump recognizes and appreciates. He is relentless in his attacks on social media. He's often on TV interviews, and he has a style that is very similar to Trump. I was watching a TV interview with him a couple of days ago and noticed that even his hand motions were quite similar to the president. And it's one that we see come through very clearly, even in ways that don't really have anything to do with his policymaking.
And just last night, Donald Trump said he was going to go ahead and fire that Federal Reserve governor who Bill Pulte accused of mortgage fraud. I think it might seem to some people like Bill Pulte's position is relatively small. Would you agree with that? Or would you say he's actually maximalizing his position?
I say the latter. I think that he really has shown a number of times that Trump is listening to him, that he often has direct access to the president, that he has support of the president's family, and that has enabled him to do things that in some cases are outside the remit of his actual job.
Today on the show, Trump's most vigorous attack dog is someone whose name you might not even know yet. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
She's made up her mind to live pretty smart. Learn to budget responsibly right from the start. She spends a little less and puts more into savings. Keeps her blood pressure low and credit score raises. She's cutting debt right out of her life. She tracks her cash flow on a spreadsheet at night.
Boring money moves make kind of lame songs, but they sound pretty sweet to your wallet. PNC Bank, brilliantly boring since 1865.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. When you visit the doctor, you probably hand over your insurance, your ID, and contact details. It's just one of the many places that has your personal info. And if any of them accidentally expose it, you could be at risk for identity theft. LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second. If you become a victim, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Okay, I want to kind of go back in time and have you just lay out who Bill Pulte is, how he became a main character in Trump world, because I truly had not heard of this agency or Bill Pulte until just the last few weeks. So where did this guy come from? What's his background?
So he is from a fairly prominent home building family. His grandfather, also named Bill Pulte, started Pulte Homes, which became a major national builder starting in the 1950s. And that really kind of catapulted his family and I think shaped his worldview and made him kind of often adjacent to this housing world. He went to Northwestern, he started a company taking photos from helicopters, and he was often described to me as having a kind of entrepreneurial spirit, especially when he was younger. Then he started this air conditioning company. He had an investment company that invested in various home building products. And then when he was in his mid-20s, he sort of reached into this kind of philanthropic side of things, clearing dilapidated homes in Detroit, in Pontiac, Michigan, and then in St. Louis.
He sounds a little bit like a Nepo baby of housing to me.
You know, he says that he is independently wealthy, that his companies were very successful, that they sold for a lot of money, and that his wealth is independent of his family. And he also, touts the fact that he has been able to give philanthropically from his own money. So I would say the first time I became aware of Bill Pulte was through his Twitter philanthropy.
What did that look like?
So in 2019, he basically started going on Twitter and saying, I want to donate to someone today. I've got $100 or $500 and I want to give it to someone who needs groceries or help with their rent. And he would basically put that call out there and people would respond to his messages with their Cash App or their PayPal information and essentially respond to his tweet. And then he would choose someone or a couple of lucky people who would then see that money show up in their accounts.
There's some strains of Mr. Beast here.
Well, there were some times that he even said, I'm going to donate a car. I want to donate a car to a veteran. And he became really prominent and also massively grew his Twitter following through that kind of approach.
What did he get from doing this?
Well, he got a lot of followers. He got a lot of attention. He really expanded his platform on social media. And he also interacted with the president every once in a while. So this would have been during Trump's first term. One of his posts at the time said, if President Trump retweets me, I'm going to donate a car to a veteran. And sure enough, President Trump did. And then around this time, Bill Pulte is also becoming part of sort of the broader Trump orbit. He's very close with Don Jr. and other members of Trump's family. He is a member at Mar-a-Lago and is sort of increasingly spending time in this world in a way that eventually gets him close enough to where a second Trump administration is considering who it wants to be in official roles.
After Donald Trump won re-election, the New York Post floated Pulte as a potential housing and urban development secretary, quoting a source who called him probably overqualified and stressing those past donations to vouch for his loyalty to Trump world. But the president nominated Pulte to head up the Federal Housing Finance Agency instead, the government bureau that sets policies for mortgage lenders. Pulte was confirmed in March.
So Pulte oversees this department that has vast troves of personal mortgage data. That doesn't mean that the head of the agency is always supposed to have access to it or that that kind of data can be used in any which way. But we see Pulte lean very heavily into using that kind of data to root out what he alleges is rampant mortgage fraud, which is something that is federally prosecuted. And he specifically announces investigations and allegations against very prominent political or judicial or economic officials, including those who are Trump's major adversaries.
Like who?
Well, first, he announces accusations against Leititia James, who is the Attorney General of New York State, and she is one of many attorneys general who has filed lawsuits against both Trump administrations. Then he announces allegations against Senator Adam Schiff, who, when he was a House member, led the impeachment proceedings against Trump during his first term. And then he announces accusations against Lisa Cook, who sits on the Federal Reserve, which is a body that has been routinely attacked both by Trump and by Pulte.
Huh. I should say here, my husband works in the office of Leititia James, so for full disclosure. But I am curious about these allegations because, first of all, the allegations of fraud here, we should lay out specifically what they look like. They're allegations that people filed for mortgages, basically saying this will be my primary residence, which entitles you to a certain kind of treatment, a certain kind of interest rate, but then they did not use those places as primary residences. Is that the allegation straight through?
Yeah, so some of the details differ depending on which person that we're talking about, but they all broadly revolve around what you just said, which is whether or not they were correctly identifying their primary residence versus what could otherwise be a second home or a rental property. And the reason those things matter is because you can get a lower mortgage rate if you are calling something your primary home, basically because it's seen as a less risky asset. And so in a hypothetical sense, someone could commit fraud by saying, no, this is my primary house, but actually I really live here most of the time. That's kind of the root of the allegations. And then I think it's important to note that people have denied wrongdoing and basically say that these claims are baseless or that they need some time to get their information together.
These allegations against folks that Donald Trump doesn't like so much, I think some people might look at them and think, well, people shouldn't be lying on their mortgage applications. That's not fair. Is there an explanation for what's going on here that is maybe more innocent or maybe explains in a more straightforward way what's happening that isn't criminal?
So I could sort of answer that in a hypothetical way. We don't really know enough information about these three examples, but if I was going to kind of spell it out based on what I've learned from various housing and lender experts that I've talked to, there are ways that people can not necessarily fill their paperwork out the right way unknowingly. I myself have never applied for a mortgage, but it sounds really complicated and it sounds like there's a lot of paperwork and that sometimes mistakes happen. But what a lot of people have also pointed out to me is that records that we might find in the public record don't always tell us the whole story. So we had been talking about, this distinction between a primary residence or a secondary home and the fact that it's really important to make sure that lenders have that correct information. What's also important is that a lender and a borrower are on the same page, that they have an agreement about how these homes are being used. So it's entirely possible in this sort of hypothetical example that I'm describing that you've got, Mr. Smith saying, hey, Mr. Lender, I'm going to live here most of the time. I know that I'm a resident in this other state, but I want you to know that I'm actually planning on living here most of the time. That's the kind of agreement that we might not see reflected in these public records that is actually really important to proving whether someone was truthful and proving that everyone had the same information.
Oh, so you're saying there may be other paperwork we don't know about where everything's kind of cleared up?
There may be other paperwork, there may be other ways to prove that kind of shared understanding. And those aren't always things that we can either find in the public record or that we have seen kind of publicly used as examples in these cases.
If you take a look at who Bill Pulte is targeting with these mortgage fraud allegations, Senator Adam Schiff, New York's Attorney General Tish James, and Federal Reserve Board Governor Lisa Cook, you may be thinking, one of these things is not like the other. Why would Bill Pulte lump a bureaucrat like Lisa Cook in with some of Trump's most public enemies? The answer seems to have something to do with the president's ongoing beef with the Federal Reserve at large, which Pulte has totally jumped in on. The FHFA director has publicly called for Jerome Powell's resignation, arguing that the Fed's policies are hurting the housing market. He's accused Jerome Powell of conducting economic warfare against America. He even wrote that draft letter firing Jerome Powell, you may have heard about. So far, Powell's job seems safe. But last night, in a legally dubious move, the president said he was firing Lisa Cook, which could let Trump fill her seat on the Federal Reserve Board with someone much more compliant.
Just to kind of recap for our listeners who Lisa Cook is, she's a renowned economist. She was put on the Fed board under the Biden administration. She's also the first Black woman to sit on the Fed. And so, in a way, she's linked to the Fed, which we know is a target of Pulte and Trump, but she hasn't really been someone singularly targeted in that way. However, she has a seat that the Trump administration would really like to fill with its own official. They are very interested in continuing to have more and more influence on the Fed through its literal policymakers. So I can imagine that, in the way that they are talking about Lisa Cook specifically, they're also talking about her seat.
The thing about the Lisa Cook investigation that I think I find troubling is that it raises this issue of the fact that the government has all kinds of data about all of us. And it really matters who's in charge of that data because they can use it in whatever way they want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a lot of questions about how these specific examples are bubbling to the surface. Pulte has very aggressively asked people to send tips of fraud into the FHFA, and on a TV interview, he said that such a tip came in about Lisa Cook. But what you're describing is kind of the next step to that, right? That therefore the government, which has all kinds of data about us, right? We've seen this play out with Social Security information, that these are things that could be at the government's disposal, or that we are seeing at the government's disposal, to be used in ways that align with the administration's agenda.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hi, this is Joe from Vanta. In today's digital world, compliance regulations are changing constantly, and earning customer trust has never mattered more. Vanta helps companies get compliant fast and stay secure with the most advanced AI, automation, and continuous monitoring out there. So whether you're a startup going for your first SOC 2 or ISO 27001, or a growing enterprise managing vendor risk, Vanta makes it quick, easy, and scalable. And I'm not just saying that because I work here. Get started at vanta.com.
I'm Ashley Graham, and as a parent, I know the back-to-school transition can be a lot. When it comes to wellness, Ollie supports me and my family through it all. Kids Multi is big in my house. It supports their immune system, and they love to take it. A win-win for everyone. Shop these products at ollie.com or retailers nationwide. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
At Blinds.com, it's not just about window treatments. It's about you, your style, your space, your way. Whether you DIY or want the pros to handle it all, you'll have the confidence of knowing it's done right. From free expert design help to our 100% satisfaction guarantee, everything we do is made to fit your life and your windows. Because at Blinds.com, the only thing we treat better than windows is you. Visit Blinds.com now for up to 50% off with minimum purchase plus a professional measure at no cost. Rules and restrictions apply.
Rachel, can we get a little wonky?
Always.
We've been talking about these investigations Bill Pulte has launched. But as you've said, his agency really is not out there to do investigations into individuals, not usually. It's usually overseeing mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and specifically supposed to keep them in line, make sure that the mortgages they're supporting are supportable, essentially. So what might Bill Pulte do with his actual authority? Or like what are people seeing him do with his actual role that's kind of different from these investigations?
A really big question going into the second Trump administration is what was going to be done with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Those might be companies that are actually much more recognizable to people. They really lay the foundation for the US mortgage market. The very popular 30-year fixed mortgage wouldn't exist without them.
I think most people know of them just as like names, and they don't really know what they actually do.
Yeah, they're companies that are foundational to the US housing market, to the US mortgage market, and they were rescued by the federal government during the 2008 mortgage meltdown. And what that meant was they were kind of swept up in this rescue effort and put under government control.
And that's the FHFA, to be clear.
And they were put under the FHFA's control. Since then, they have kind of hung around in this sort of limbo purgatory where they're under government control, but they're still kind of their own companies. They aren't totally one or the other. And a big looming policy question has been, is that just going to stay the case forever? Or are they eventually going to be spun off and made their own private companies again? The Trump administration, the first time around, was very intent on removing them from that kind of government control. And so the kind of logic that followed from that was that the second Trump administration would try to do the same. But there is a long, long, and as you said, very wonky list of questions about how exactly that was going to be done. And that is really the kind of thing that we expected the FHFA director, along with some other Trump officials, to be settling this time around.
Well, Bill Pulte has made some aggressive moves here, right? Like in the first few weeks of his leadership, he basically took over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
He did. He did it in ways that were not entirely in line with this kind of policy question. At the time, it was kind of hard to figure out, okay, if he's doing this, then what does it mean for that kind of policy question? But what he did was he removed the top leadership of Fannie and Freddie really just in a couple of days. He fired the majority of board members. He installed his own board members. And then he also made himself the chairman of both companies. There, too, it's a little confusing to know kind of what that gives him, since he already was the director of the agency that was in charge of those companies.
Well, now he's definitely the king of mortgages.
Yeah, he's the king of mortgages. He has his allies installed in other board positions, and he has really kind of cemented his power in a way that maybe doesn't make a difference for, what he could do before versus what he could do now, but I think sends a broader signal of the way that he's trying to cement and solidify his control.
Yeah, I guess the question is how he's going to use this power. And you've talked about privatization of Fannie and Freddie, which, they were private before the 2008 financial crash. So I don't really know how to think about the idea of privatization. I know it's a Trump administration goal. That doesn't necessarily seem like a bad goal. Like people in the industry, when they think about what could happen if Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are privatized, how are they thinking about it?
Yeah, what I find is that there are a couple of different examples of how people feel. And when you get into this world, there are people who feel very strongly about what happens with Fannie and Freddie. There is a school of thought that is more ideological, that private companies should not be in government control, that they should be independent and not hang around in this setting that also was not supposed to exist forever. That's a kind of like academic ideological school of thought.
And it's not a bad school of thought. It's just that the reason why Fannie and Freddie are under conservatorship is because being private really didn't work. It exposed them to a lot of risk.
Right, especially in a moment of real emergency. But now we're kind of far away from that emergency. Maybe we should not just assume that this is the way things should be always. Then you have a group of people who are kind of maybe neutral on whether Fannie and Freddie are private or public, but are much more concerned with the way this process will unfold. And their concern is that this is such a delicate, technical system that also has enormous power over the mortgage market, the housing market, and by extension, the US economy, that if you try to untangle these companies from their government hands, you could really mess that up. And you could do it in a way, either accidental or intentional, that sends mortgage rates way up, that dashes confidence in the US housing system. And so it's not really about do you leave or not, but it's more, do you have a plan to do that? And are you sure that it is one that can be handled with care?
From your observation, does it seem that Bill Pulte is interested in that sort of subtle, delicate work?
My impression from talking to people who work for him, either specific to this issue or others, is that his attention is not on those fine details. Now, to his credit, that's why he has a whole department of people who are often much more heads down in that kind of technical, wonky work. But from people I have spoken to who have been in meetings with him or who have otherwise interacted with him for a whole range of policy issues, that is really not his focus. And it's often one that seems kind of out of his depth as well.
Okay, so it seems like there's this question of what happens with Fannie and Freddie under Bill Pulte and some legitimate concerns. I gotta say, when I was looking through Bill Pulte's history, the thing that caught my attention of something he's done mortgage related in his new role, he was tweeting about how he wants to allow people to list cryptocurrency as an asset on a mortgage application.
Mm-hmm.
This struck me because crypto is really volatile.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the FHFA was put into place to stabilize the mortgage industry. It feels like this is just an injection of risk that we don't have to make.
And that is definitely what some people told me in response to that announcement. There are a lot of people who say, hey, a growing number of Americans have crypto as assets. Can we figure out a way to be able to incorporate that into other financial processes? But what I think that is an example of is the announcement of policy without the details or guidance to be able to answer that exact question, to be able to assess or explain that risk or answer how it would be offset or counteracted. There were a lot of people I spoke to who said, it's so volatile. How are you going to account for price swings? Which exchanges are you even going to include? And those are all very fair questions that presumably could be worked out if this was a policy that was really seriously being worked through. But these policies just aren't being announced in ways that can either soothe that kind of worry or even give people instructions to be able to figure out how to implement it in the first place.
Okay, so because of this conversation, I feel like I have a pretty good idea of what Bill Pulte is doing for Donald Trump. It's a little murkier to me what he's doing with the mortgage industry or to the mortgage or housing market. Do you think the decisions Bill Pulte's making at the FHFA are going to result in lower interest rates? Do we know?
I think it's a little too soon to know. And I think that for a couple of reasons. One, the policies that he's announced don't necessarily fit under a kind of common umbrella, either a kind of general policymaking stance or a kind of ideological stance. So it's a little bit hard to map some of them together. But I also think there hasn't really been a whole lot of time for those policies to be implemented. I think there are a lot of people who are seeking more information to try and figure out how to even implement them in the first place. But, another important thing is that the FHFA doesn't set mortgage rates, neither does the Federal Reserve. And so there is this kind of key influence here that can really bring mortgage rates down. And it's not really within Pulte's control. So I think a bigger question is kind of how he crafts policy around that. And I think about 6 months in, it's still a little too soon to tell.
We started out this conversation talking about how rare it is to know who the head of the FHFA is. And I think a lot of people still don't know Bill Pulte's name. Do you think that's going to change in the next year or so?
I really do. And I think that's because it's not just that Bill Pulte is, using his platform in a way that is really trying to blast his message out there. It's because we know that that is augmented by access and influence to Trump. And I think that is a really telling distinction here. He's not just someone who is loyal to the president's agenda and trying to maximize that with whatever power he or she has, but it's one that is really being rewarded. And I think that is why we could either see Pulte's influence or power only grow, or he becomes someone who, people who don't have to be heads down in the inner workings of the FHFA would start to know about too.
Rachel, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Rachel Siegel is a reporter covering the economics of real estate and housing over at The Washington Post. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Blue Sky if you'd like. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.